Hi everyone, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to today's session on backlash, body politics and online misogyny. I'm just going to go over some very brief housekeeping things before we get started. So first, today we have live interpretation into Spanish. So please remember to check to change your language. So please select the language that you want to listen to the session in using the little globe icon at the bottom of your screen. Even if it's English, because we do have a Spanish speaker today, so please do that. We're also live streaming on Wordly, which will allow you to have subtitles in 18 different languages. And to access that, go to the top of your screen where it says live on custom live streaming service and click on view stream. Today you can follow the event on Facebook or Twitter if you want to get involved. You can use the hashtag Ubuntu Symposium or hashtag Symposio Ubuntu in Spanish. Another thing I want to point out is that we recommend using speaker view today so you can see our wonderful panelists. So welcome to the session today. Today's session is session 2 in the series on countering patriarchal or anti-feminist backlash. The aim of the series is really to kind of help us all understand the very complex nature of this backlash that we're seeing in the world today, kind of how it plays out in different regions, different contexts, what Masculinities has to do with it, and what MenEngage Alliance and its member organizations and others working with men and boys can do about it. So the first session, which we had before Christmas, was kind of a global historical overview of the backlash that we're seeing today. And in this session, what we wanted to do is really kind of focus in on some of the kind of different strands or arenas that backlash is playing out in particular, sexual and reproductive health and rights and sexuality, and also kind of the rise in online misogyny that we're seeing. So future sessions, keep an eye out on the symposium program for future sessions. There's going to be 3 more in the series, and in the next one, we really want to go into kind of backlash and the co-option of gender and development policy spaces. And then following that, we're going to have a more interactive participatory workshop where we can kind of interact with each other and really start kind of strategizing and crowdsourcing different strategies for MenEngage and other organizations to counter this backlash. So for today, the format of the session is going to be that we have 2 conversations between speakers, and then if we have time, we'll come together at the end and try and kind of draw some parallels between the 2 and pull together some of the conversation. So it's going to be co-moderated today by Nikki van der Gaag and Magali Marquez. That's it. So I'll pass over to you, Nikki.
Sinead, do you want to say who you are for those who don't know?
Sorry, I'm Sinead. I'm with MenEngage Alliance Global Secretariat. Thanks.
And Sinead's been one of the main organisers of all these sessions, so thank you very much, Sinead. And thanks also to the interpreters before we start, because I know they do a great job, and I'll try and talk slowly. So yeah, my name is Nikki van der Gaag, or van der Gaag. I'm an independent gender consultant and a senior fellow at Promundo. And as Sinead said, in a spirit of feminist collaboration, I'm co-moderating this session with Sinead, but particularly with Magali Marquez, who's going to run the second half on body politics and introduce the speakers for that session. Magali, I don't know if you want to just let people hear your voice for a second.
Yeah, good morning, good evening, and Magali with MenEngage Alliance, and coordinating most of SRHR work. So pleasure to be here. We'll talk more later. I'll let Nikki run the show for now.
Okay, so Sinead's already explained this is going to be in 2 parts. We want to follow the model that we used last time, which was chaired by Jirka Edstrom, where people who were presenting had a chance to present and then to have a conversation before taking questions from the audience. We're really conscious that sometimes you sit a long time listening, so we want to make it as participative as possible, and we'll hope to have time for a plenary at the end as well. So Sinead has explained it's part of a series, and this is the second one. And this particular session is going to look at these 2 areas, online misogyny and body politics. But I wanted to give a little bit of context to what we mean by backlash and how we might situate these debates, and then just talk very briefly, introduce the online session. online misogyny session rather than an online session. So Backlash is actually the title of a 1947 Hollywood movie in which a man frames his wife for a murder he's committed. And the backlash against women's rights works in much the same way. It blames feminists for the crimes it perpetrates. Patriarchal backlash we're witnessing today is deep, it's insidious, and it's complex. It's both online and offline, and has spread deeply into all areas of our lives. From the rise of right-wing populism, the incel, involuntary celibate movement, which I'm sure we'll hear about, and anti-gender policies in many countries. Patriarchy is very much alive and shouting very loudly in Trump, thankfully now gone, but his supporters are not, Putin, Modi, Bolsonaro, and other world leaders. Much of this support is rooted in fear of change, the reaching for what feels like certainty in a world which often feels chaotic, uncertain, and confused, and a craving to belong to something. American feminist Susan Faludi, who wrote a book on backlash 30 years ago now, said, "By casting feminism as the villain that must be defeated to validate the central conceit of modern manhood, men avoid confronting powerful cultural and social expectations that have a lot more to do with their unhappiness than with the latest sexual harassment ruling." So how do we, as MenEngage and other feminist and social justice organizations, confront these expectations about what it means to be a man and, importantly, the structures that support this? As Alan Gregg pointed out in his recent paper for MenEngage, which you'll find on the website, called Context and Challenges for Gender Transformative Work with Men and Boys. Alan cited a blog by David Paternotti, who's Associate Professor in Sociology at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, entitled Backlash, a Misleading Narrative. And I just want to quote one line from it here. "The backlash narrative drives scholars, observers, and practitioners into the study of what is under attack. And it doesn't allow them to see that the assaults on women or LGBTQI rights take part in a wider project, which strives to establish a new political, less liberal, and less democratic order." We talked about that. There was a really good conversation about that in the first session, so do listen to that again if you can. But in this context, it is concerning that backlash seems to be gaining rather than losing momentum. And fuel is added to the fire by online groups, as Laura Bates, a British woman who founded the Everyday Sexism Project, points out in her shocking new book, which I don't know if you've read, but Men Who Hate Women, it's called, From Incels to Pickup Artists, The Truth About Extreme Misogyny and How It Affects Us All. She notes that ideas that had previously been confined to the murkiest corners of the internet are taking on new life, hiding in plain sight. And as her book makes clear, these ideas are violent. It's a really scary read. And they spill into real life and shape what young men in particular are thinking and sometimes what they do. Her book's not easy reading, and this is not an easy topic. She notes, "We cannot confront the very real threat these groups pose unless we're prepared to look it directly in the eye. And that's what we're going to do today, while holding fast to the values that we at MenEngage believe in: transparency, accountability, and a grounding in feminist analysis." So to have this conversation, I'm delighted to introduce Becky Faith, Research Fellow at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex in the UK. She's going to bring her experience of the Countering Backlash programme with partners in Uganda, Kenya, India, Bangladesh, and Brazil. And so important, this is not just a global North phenomenon. And Alex Branco, co-founder and executive director of the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism in the US, is going to speak about the importance of paying more attention to growing male supremacist mobilizations and anti-feminist conspiracism. We're really sorry not to have Loke Nielsen from Dare Gender, who's based in Nigeria and works against backlash. But he emailed yesterday, he said he's just contracted COVID. So our thoughts are really with him, as with many others around the world who are suffering from COVID at this point in time. So Becky and Alex, you're going to give a short talk and then have a conversation, and after which we'll take some questions from the rest of you as the audience. So I'm going to hand straight over to Becky. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Nikki, for that great introduction, and thanks to Sinead and everyone who's put so much effort into organising this symposium. I'm just going to share my screen because I've got a quick presentation. So just to introduce myself properly, there we go. I'm Dr. Becky Faith, and I lead the digital research group at the Institute of Development Studies. And I'm also looking at the Backlash Online for the Countering Backlash programme, which we're running at the Institute of Development Studies, generously funded by CEDA. And I'd urge you to go and visit the Countering Backlash website. And I know that partners from Countering Backlash presented in the last symposium, and we have Sabrina presenting shortly as well. So I urge you to go and sign up for updates, follow us on Twitter, and follow me on Twitter as well. So just to say that the program, the Countering Backlash program, we're working with partners in Brazil, Uganda, Kenya, India, Bangladesh, and Lebanon. So I'm just going to be talking a bit today about how we're conceptualizing and seeing the online backlash. And also I want to introduce some frameworks for thinking about how to tackle it. What do we do about it? And I'm indebted to the work of scholars like Alex and other scholars in the US in particular who've done incredible work looking at the online backlash and how it's formed. So these online spaces where men's rights activists can connect and mobilise, and the kind of affordances of these online spaces that anybody can join, the low barriers to entry, they're the most kind of obvious manifestation, the most visible digital manifestation of the backlash, so Reddit communities and so on and so forth. And there's specificities, the particular details and approaches of these groups, that they vary, and we'll see how they vary around the world as well. But there's a common discourse that feminism, that Nikki was talking about, that feminism has gone too far, and that men are experiencing reverse discrimination. So those are some of the common aspects that we see. So you might think, oh, well, what have digital spaces got to do with the kind of real world? But we've seen with Trump's election and with incidences of violence, how these kind of identities are cultivated and people find they're strengthened in online spaces, but then they're translated into political action. And I think this phrase, a networked ecology of paranoia, is materialized online. So this sort of these paranoid ideas about masculinity is being under threat. And I think it's absolutely vital to understand that it's driven by the way that not just Facebook, but all digital platforms are engineered to want to look at the economics of this. And I was so pleased to see Alan Green talking about this in the digital context bit of the report that came out yesterday. So talking about the financial drivers of the backlash, that Facebook and all these other platforms, they're monetized by clicks, they're monetized by our attention. And so the more extreme, although we have seen the platforms taking action against extreme content, it's actually that's the economy, this attention economy. So it's driven. So it's really important to understand the kind of economics of the platforms if we're thinking about how to address the backlash, and to understand how that amplifies these messages as well. So we're at the start of the backlash program, but in the first year, our partners have been writing for us about how they're seeing the online backlash in the spaces that they're working in. So CHSJ in India have been talking about right-wing Hindu agenda, so using online networks and tools, using armies of trolls, manufacturing outrage through fake news and WhatsApp. And I think that sentence that they use is that technology is being used to create an environment which is comfortable for government and for the big corporations. Although having said that, just this morning we're seeing there was a report about the Indian government kind of going to war with Twitter over the farmers' protests. So I think there's but overall there's an enabling environment for online hostility. In Bangladesh, so we see around the world, and this is a particular instance from Bangladesh, about leaking information about high-profile women, whether this is female actors, or in this case in Bangladesh or in other places, whether it's female women who are involved in political life in some way. So their quote is drawing vitriol en masse about their transgressions by these women against their expected set of roles. So there's a kind of policing of gender and a policing of women's bodies. And I think overall, what we see is that there's a hostility toward and the backlash, online backlash, in its various forms, whether it's these the manosphere or whether it's harassment against individual women on Twitter. It doesn't just shut down feminist discourse, it kind of shuts down civic space for women generally. So if we think about civic space and the way we are acting as citizens online, the fact that women can expect to receive vitriol means that online space is closed to them. So in the Countering Backlash programme, we're trying to think about ways of kind of conceptualising the power of male supremacist power online. So in order to give us directions about how we might address it. And this framing of visible, hidden and invisible power is something that we've been working with our partners, and it's a kind of quite a fundamental way of thinking about power that we use at IDS. It's from Just Associates. So there's that power manifests in different ways. So there's the visible power, so which underpins this male supremacy online. So that could be even things like internet shutdowns and network disruptions, which basically says, look, there's not going to be any discourse online. A male-dominated IT industry, which engineers the platforms so that so if you think about the origins of Facebook as a platform developed by Mark Zuckerberg for kind of rating women in his door, I think that tells you a lot about the kind of visible power. There's hidden power. So there's like anonymous men perpetuating online violence. There's the social media governance platforms in which kind of women and marginalised groups aren't represented. And there's the invisible power. So that's the power of like shaping what's normal. And I think that's really, really powerful with like the groups like the incels and in the manosphere of like different kind of framings of what kind of man it's acceptable to be. And this the way that this might manifest is that men might be sharing this content without really realizing what it means, or be using terms that are kind of offensive without actually realizing what it means. But by sharing them, they're gaining the terms are gaining power. Women might be kind of driven off certain platforms because they're internalizing these threats. And I think part of our job in the Countering Backlash programme is thinking then about, well, what do we do about this? And we've started thinking about these different mechanisms that you might use for countering the backlash. And because sometimes it's very hard to kind of grasp the power. Where is the power in these systems? So looking at these different manifestations of visible and hidden and invisible power might give us some ideas about strategies. What tactics might we use to address these power issues? So that ranges from the kind of basic things of kind of just skills building, helping people be more kind of critical citizens online, lobbying and monitoring, but also things like digital security and self-care training for feminist activists. That's something I've been involved in my previous life in NGOs, in doing digital security training for activists, holding the platforms accountable. There are mechanisms that just aren't used effectively, making sure they're used, that international human rights mechanisms are used, and that they're embedded in national policies as well. And I think there's something really powerful for the MenEngage community to be thinking about, which Alan talks about in his paper, about both like building alternate online communities for young men to sort of reject this misogynistic messaging. And just before I finish, I just wanted to give an example of, so my son who's 12, he started like using some term, and it was kind of an offensive term about women that he'd kind of picked up from kids at school, and it was a kind of online incel term. And I was going on about it, saying, oh, it's really bad. But then his cousin, who's 18, said, oh, you really shouldn't use that. That's an example of toxic masculinity, and explained to him why it was bad. And he wouldn't listen to me because I'm his mum, and you don't want to listen to your mum going on about these things. But he would listen to his cousin. He'd listen to a male cousin. So actually thinking about the role of peers, basically, in kind of educating educating younger men, I think is really, really important. And I know it was a very sort of powerful experience for me. So just some provocations. One of the things that we're really interested in the Backlash programme is looking at the similarities and differences between different contexts. Are the same strategies being used? Is the spread of these movements organic, or are we seeing kind of key instigators, that there's certain nodes or people who are kind of spreading these ideas? What characteristics lead to particular messaging or particular terms going viral? And what are the links with reinforcing stereotypical ideas about femininity and women's roles? So I'll stop there, and because I'd love to hear, really looking forward to hearing what Alex has got to say and what the audience has got to say as well. But thank you for your time, and hope you can come and visit the website at counteringbacklash.org.
Thank you, Becky. That was really comprehensive, and I really appreciate those questions at the end. Really hoping that you can start picking them up in the chat. I'm going to move straight to Alex, but do keep those questions coming, and we will pick them up. Alex, I can't. Yeah, there you are. Do you want to kick off now and tell us a bit about yourself as well?
Definitely, yeah. So first of all, I want to apologize. I am having a computer problem, and so I'm calling in from my cell phone, and I won't be able to be on video with everyone else today. My name is Alex Branco. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism. We were founded in 2019 by a group of academics and researchers who had been doing work around areas of misogyny and male supremacism, and felt like there was really a gap in paying enough attention to it, and had encountered a lot of resistance with getting this work taken seriously. And so we formed this organization to call more attention to these movements that demonstrate hostile misogyny, and provide a space for researchers to come together. There's so much that I could talk about on this topic. But I want to paint some kind of broad strokes given our short time and wanting to have this be a dialogue with questions. And I really appreciate some of the structural overview that was given in the prior presentation. I think this backlash framing is a really excellent entry point when we look at the male supremacist movements that have been active. My work is particularly focused in the United States and the ideologies that come out of the US. With the nature of the internet, while the United States is a place, along with Canada, where there has been a lot of growth and development of ideologies, they spread in an international kind of space. And so we've seen these groups particularly kind of networked around the US, Canada, United Kingdom, and Australia, places where English is the primary language, but also influencing places like India, influencing places like Sweden, where most people speak English. And so it really requires a transnational approach to think about where these movements are having their greatest impact. Over the past half century, and I think especially since the 1990s, has been where, in response to the various women's rights movements around the globe, and the real, though insufficient, advances that women have been making, have fueled these various male supremacist ideologies. And groups like the men's rights movement that was mentioned in the prior presentation have this framing of presenting men as the victims of society, as those who are truly structurally oppressed, as part of their response to that turn. In the more recent manifestations of what are increasingly extreme and violent online misogynist movements, I would talk about in that respect misogynist incels, which stands for involuntarily celibate, men who feel that it is an injustice that they have not been able to have sexual intercourse with women. They have received particularly significant attention recently because there have been multiple attacks, acts of mass violence connected to misogynist incel ideology, starting in 2014 with an attack in Santa Barbara, and with an uptick in those attacks from 2018 forward. To date, the attacks have mostly been in the United States and Canada, but there have been some thwarted attacks, planned bombings in the United Kingdom. And so this is a concern that, many countries should be looking at in considering the kind of impact that can be had. And while these communities are often dismissed as the nature of sort of online organizing as not serious, we see really typical social movement manifestations that are bringing these mobilizations together. The 2014 Santa Barbara perpetrator left behind a manifesto where he talked about his sense of injustice. He's honored in these online misogynist communities as a martyr and a hero and a saint every year on the anniversary of the attack. They quote from his manifesto. And so there's this real adherence to the glorification of violence that we see in those communities. And we highlight two motivating factors that really seem to be key across most of the secular misogynist ideologies that have grown over the past few years. One is this sense of sexual entitlement, and it manifests in different ways with mass violence from elements of the misogynist incel community. If we look at pickup artists or the red pill, these are communities that teach what they say are methods of seduction. But if you look at their lessons, what they amount to is advocating coercion and sexual assault. So that's their version of responding to what they see as the feminist structure. The movement across, the globe, there have been laws protecting women against sexual harassment over the past decades, against sexual violence. In India, laws against dowry abuse. And these different versions, it might look a little different from country to country, something like dowry abuse in India versus the campus movement in the United States to improve sexual violence policy. But they have the same kind of roots, that they are about men's right to dominate and control women's bodies, men's sense of entitlement to that control, to that access to women's bodies. And I think it goes, well into the conversation that we'll have in the second part of this talk, because, abortion and reproductive rights are other ways of controlling women's bodies as well. And the other aspect that we see that's really motivating these ideologies is increasing anti-feminist conspiracism. And when we look at the kind of conspiracy theories that they push about feminists, they look similar to what we would be familiar with in terms of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that have a long history on the right wing, where they talk about, you know, a shadowy elite force that is secretly in control of everything. The Soros conspiracy is a popular one. I was recently accused of being part of the Soros conspiracy by a right-wing website, which is kind of, I think, a rite of passage for anyone who works on supremacist movements. And so when we see their conspiracy theories about feminists, it is a similar kind of model, that this is a shadowy elite that are pulling the strings behind the scenes, that they actually control society to the detriment of men. And so those two versions of sexual entitlement and anti-feminist conspiracism are particularly animating the recent movements in different ways. And this is a shift from the issues that had more significance from the 70s through the 90s, the fathers' rights movement, an aspect of the men's rights movement that focused on opposing required child support payments, and other views of how family courts were against men, was for a number of decades the main focus. And it was a slightly older group of men as well, middle-aged, often divorced, given the context of the issue. And so these movements in the online era have made this shift to attempting to recruit younger and younger men, often reaching boys when they are in high school, and that this is contributing to these problems of online radicalization. And so, because I think I'm over time, to wrap up, I will just mention that given that kind of scope, what we generally recommend at the Institute is a mainstream to margins approach, that male supremacism is something that appears not only in extreme versions, but also is, you know, patriarchy is an entrenched part of society, and the things that are learned early on, and the overall kind of rape culture that we see in society, views towards women, animate these more radical movements as well. And so we advocate revisiting literature curricula, which are often very focused on male authors and characters that often depict scenes of sexual violence. We suggest comprehensive consent-based sexuality education. And so, you know, in addition to some of these interventions that the de-radicalization sphere talks about that take place kind of later on in the tech and platform kind of stage, which we also, you know, endorse and support, we want to be working at an earlier point as well for, you know, a more feminist, anti-racist view of society. So thank you. I'm looking forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Alex. That's a really interesting presentation. And yeah, I can think of lots of things to ask. I also know, having looked at the participants, that a number of participants who are listening also have their own experiences. So please do put those in the chat box. I think we already got a really interesting one from Nalini in India about what's happening at this very moment in time, the social media backlash against international female celebrities, Rihanna and Greta Thunberg. They've been speaking out about the farmers' protests in a very and the response has been very misogynistic: rape threats, abuse, slut-shaming, trolling. And she says it's bringing out the intersections between masculinity, misogyny, and right-wing hyper-nationalistic discourses that can been seen in various contexts globally. And I think one of the things that's interesting about what you've both brought out is, you know, sometimes with this online discourse, there's a discussion that, oh, well, it's a global north thing. It's absolutely clearly not. And it also is not something that's just restricted to online. I like your mainstream to margins approach, but I also think that that happens in terms of online to offline, and that they're not completely separate worlds, and they do spill over. So, Becky, Alex, do you have? I want to give you the privilege first. Do you have a question for each other that you'd like to ask, as we wanted to make this into a bit of a conversation?
I wanted to, Alex, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I'm sorry we can't see your face, but I'm really interested in the kind of in how things go viral, and about how, not just in terms of a hashtag, but in terms of particular identities or particular approaches. And have you got an idea of what are the characteristics of particular messages that you've seen going viral? What is it that might cause a particular, why have the incels become so popular, for example? I don't know if you've got any reflections about that. And also just wanted to say thank you for bringing in the whole idea about sort of paranoid conspiracy theories. And as someone of Jewish descent, I'm really familiar with the kind of paranoid conspiracy theories about Jewish people, and it's really interesting to see, interesting and disturbing to see these same tactics used against feminists. So what makes something go viral? What do you think makes something go viral? Because we're also seeing these things spreading around the world.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I think that, there's been some focus in the media about specific things like the Gamergate campaign in the United States that attracted a lot of attention. And there are certainly one-off campaigns that, can expose these movements to more people. But often what the sort of more viral one-off campaigns do is attract the attention of the mainstream to something that's already been going on. And so what we found in the course of doing our research was that something like the Gamergate campaign, despite being a really big deal in the United States and also covered in a lot of international media, it didn't bring an influx of people into these misogynist communities. It was more of a symptom of the consistent growth that had already been going on in these communities, and that this one reached mainstream attention. And so these communities, some of them existed in offline form from the 70s. But for the most part, by the 1990s, they were on some of the earliest online messaging boards. And so they've been building for, at least 20 years, 25 years now. And so there have been different manifestations. The misogynist incel movement, for instance, is a little bit more recent, but a lot of its ideology comes from the pickup artist movement, which has a much longer history, and its ideology there. And so I think that we actually see, even though these are movements that organize primarily online, is that they're mobilized in a similar way that any social movement would be, that they present a sense of injustice. They take the individual grievances of boys and men and give them a narrative that this is a grander injustice that they take part in. One of the controversies over deplatforming is the concern that it pushes people into darker spaces and echo chambers. But I think one of the strong arguments for deplatforming is that recruitment tends to happen in spaces like Reddit, where they go to other forums where they think there might be support for them from gamer forums, because those have been particularly dominated by men, to forums that support politicians like Donald Trump, who has certainly given a boost to misogynist and racist movements. And so I think that what we are seeing now in what looks like viral outbreaks of these kinds of movements sometimes is actually because there wasn't enough attention to them previously, and that they are now benefiting from many years under the radar of building their ideologies, of building their membership, of building their structure, and certainly benefiting from mainstream misogyny in society in doing so. And we're playing catch up, having only really started to focus in the past few years for the most part on these issues.
Alex, can I just ask you, because I'm not, some people will be more familiar with this space than others. Could you just in one sentence just say what Gamergate is and also a pickup artist so that people know? Because I think there's a lot of language talked here that sometimes it's difficult to understand, and actually we need to understand it.
Sure. Gamergate was a campaign in the United States in our video game industry that the promoters claimed was about ethics in journalism, but was really about anger over increasing diversity and women entering the video game industry. And so they fabricated stories, first about a particular video game developer, sleeping with or dating journalists to get coverage, and then just moved into a generalized harassment campaign against a number of women in the video game industry. And pickup artists are one of the kind of streams of secular misogyny. They started in the offline era with books like How to Pick Up Women in response to the women's rights movement. But in the past few decades have increasingly become these misogynistic spaces that I mentioned before, that teach what they call strategies of seduction, but are actually objectifying of women, deep gender stereotypes, and then sexual coercion and sexual assault as part of what they teach. And there was even a case a few years ago of two instructors and their students actually being convicted of sexual assault for part of what they teach as their field lessons.
I think it's really important to give those concrete examples because it makes you realize how really scary these things are. So Alex, just we've got a little bit more time, and do you want to ask Becky a question?
Yeah, I would really love to hear a little bit more about that second to last slide you brought up in the Countering Backlash space. For some more information on that countering piece and what you really recommend are interventions that we can take to heart and potentially take to heart, whether we're researchers or journalists or organizers, what the kind of key recommendations of your organization are.
Becky, we've got just a sort of 5 minutes max on that.
Okay, so I'm just fiddling with my computer, unfortunately. So we started developing this framework to look at how, where power was, to identify where power was in the backlash. Because I think one of the difficulties when you're talking about digital spaces is the guys on Reddit can seem very powerful, and actually there's different layers of visible and invisible power. So this is why I started developing this framework. And so the strategies that we're starting to think about are strategies for tackling the visible power, the hidden power, and the invisible power. And so there's been years of work by feminist activists, digital feminist activists across programs like the APC Women's Programme, their Feminist Internet Research Network more recently, about how you bring women into digital governance spaces, for example, on the big kind of internet governance forums, how you can get feminist views in there. But that's also a recognition of the fact that we have very little power over the platforms. So I think just to kind of talk through this framework more kind of methodically, in terms of the kind of visible power of the internet industry, I think kind of lobbying and monitoring, data collection. I think one of the issues, the challenges that we're facing at the moment is that there's actually isn't international aggregated data about online gender-based violence. So there's local data and some regional data about just how many women experience online gender-based violence. There's a great report by an NGO called Policy recently about online GBV in, I think, 5 different African countries. But there's very little global aggregated data for us to say, well, just how big is this thing? How big is this problem? I think demanding building this issue of digital security, how we can help women feel safer online, and rather than being kind of driven offline by the kind of fear of violence, figuring out ways to increase their digital security so they feel safe and so they can have safe conversations online to sort of build consciousness. Using existing laws and ensuring that organisations realise that there is international human rights law that they can bring to bear on these issues, that they can use national laws just on kind of safety and anti-violence laws, that they can use those on digital spaces, like incitement to violence laws. And I think, yeah, this idea of the kind of tackling the kind of norms shaping, which is what you started talking about when you were talking about sort of getting involved at the kind of the source with in education and with just what kids are reading, sort of shaping what's normal. So one way of doing that is like supporting alternative internet communities and like amplifying them and figuring out those spaces, because often I think what happens online as well is that there's such a sort of blurring of weird paranoid spaces, and we're seeing this at the moment actually with the kind of COVID vaccination thing, where you get kind of weird combinations of like alternative health communities affiliating with QAnon communities to put forward kind of anti-vaccine propaganda. And I think that's one of the things that can happen with online spaces, that you can get these weird paranoid communities kind of aligning with each other that you wouldn't think would actually be kind of weird bedfellows, if you will, like weird alliances. So actually amplifying the kind of more kind of positive spaces and building that into education as well, building that more into kind of digital literacy education. So kids right from kind of my son's age, from sort of year 12-year-olds are starting to understand about the power of online spaces and the power of like what they're saying and the language that they're using, and realizing where it came from and what it means. So yeah, that's what I would suggest. But we're going to publish a working paper on this quite soon to be able to read more.
I've put the Countering Backlash website up, so do keep an eye on that as well, for new material that's coming out. We've got another few minutes and I want to hand over to Magali, but there's some really interesting observations in the chat box, which we probably won't have time to go into all of them in detail, but I wanted to pick up on Jirka's point really about the intersectionality, because patriarchy is not just clearly about the way it oppresses women. There is a hugely intersectional piece here in terms of race and gender and LGBTQI and other, and kind of the way that they kind of come together. I was at a meeting yesterday of a number of members of parliament who were discussing in the UK something what they call the online harms bill, where they're trying to actually prevent some of what you've been talking about going on. And they talked about the fact that's quite well known here in the UK. There's a black, quite well-known Labour member of parliament called Diane Abbott. And in terms of women members of parliament get far more sexist online abuse, racist online abuse than anyone else. Diane Abbott had half of all the racist and sexist abuse that everybody else got, because she was black and a woman. And I think your point, Becky, and I think Chloe's point here about being Jewish, picking up on that it feels really important to actually think about the connections between these things, that it's not just these silos, but actually this abuse is directed at women, but it's also directed at a whole range of other intersectional identities that we need to acknowledge. And Chloe has put a point in the chat box about an experience she had, which sounds really, really unpleasant. I'm really sorry, Chloe, but it also shows very clearly that this is all linked together. And I think the kind of intersectional approach that MenEngage is trying to have is absolutely the foundation of some of these discussions. That we mustn't let one lot of people be picked off separately from another. So I think we've almost run out of time. Thank you so much, Becky and Alex. I think this has been a really good discussion. As usual, we could have had much longer than we've had already. But there will be time at the end, I hope, to pick up on some of these questions if you have some more questions on the online space when we've done the body politics bit. But certainly very, very rich material there. So thank you very much, both of you. And I'm going to hand over to Magali.
Thank you, Nikki. This was fantastic. And thank you, Becky and Alex, for your insights. It's a fascinating discussion as we had in the first session as well with what's going on. And, it's also something important to keep in mind that, this is not new. This is something that has been building on for a long, long time. But it has taken on a different shape at this point in history with the confluence of different aspects of the resistance of the status quo, and backlash, as we call it, has had. It's like supremacy and patriarchy trying to stay in place and feeling threatened and anticipating what could come, and therefore their attack on views of more democratic spaces that are more inclusive are being more noticed. But for this segment, what I wanted to, welcome our guests. We will have Sabina Rashid, a researcher and professor and dean of the School of Public Health of Branco University in Bangladesh. She's a medical anthropologist, extensively published. I'm not going to get into all your biography and your work, but welcome, Sabina, for being here with us today. We also have Neil Datta, who has been active in sexual reproductive rights for a long time in Europe, and he's today part of the European Parliamentary Forum for Sexual and Reproductive Rights. And we are also happy to have Maria Alicia Gutierrez, a sociologist from the University of Buenos Aires. She is also a member of the National Commission on Women, Gender, and Diversity. I think I got it right. Maybe I got it wrong. The name of the commission, and actively involved in the Marea Verde or the Green Wave in Argentina. That is responsible for the discriminalization, legalization of safe legal abortion in Argentina since last December, after a long, campaign in the country, and it's a model for the continent. So we're very happy to hear from the three of you. And before we start, I just wanted to recall one thing that was mentioned. There was so much, in the first session of the backlash. That is, they were discussing, Denise and Sonia, about the anti-gender and anti-abortion, the confluence of those two narratives. It's not only anti-gender, it's also anti-abortion. There's very strong elements that go hand in hand. But what Sonia said in that conversation was that what we need to pay attention to is the deep imprint of a natural gender binary that operates at the center of the heteronormative family. So the conception of family as exclusively heteronormative, which means the natural differences between men and women are highlighted as opposites and complementary, and exclusively And that's what makes, the unit of the family, and that discourse is very important. And highlighting that conception of natural family as natural binary, as a system of power, that exercises and justifies control over, within that binary, and exclusive access to things, or exclusion of, and denial of rights of others, as all part of the binary. So I wanted to just leave you with that as a provocation, for us to get started. There's so much that we already heard from the first segment, these narratives and these controls of space online, also democratic spaces and public spaces. But it's also control of people's bodies, sexuality, and the denial of rights. I would also remind you to not speak too fast, because we have interpretation, and Maria Alicia will be speaking in Spanish when her time comes. But I wanted to start with Sabina. How are things going in Bangladesh, and what can you tell us about your struggles over there?
I think for me, I have it relatively easier than the research I'm going to present today on the LGBTQI communities that have been affected. Many of the informal workers have been affected. Many of the politics is messy in this space. There's a lot of silencing of voices across. But I was going to ask, is it Sinead to share my presentation, or should I just go straight into it? Because I know I have 5 minutes. I'm not really sure how this works, so I know that. Thank you. So I'm a medical anthropologist by training. I'm one of the colleagues and one of the Bangladesh team members working closely with Yerka on Countering Backlash. So we're looking at masculinities in slum settlements. But we're also looking at many different groups in this and other research projects looking at transgender populations. So this really is an overview of the impact of COVID-19. We did 18 interviews from July to September 2020. These are individuals whose identities fall beyond the gender binary and whose sexual orientation is non-heterosexual. All of these participants either actively were engaged or engaged in organizing activism through informal groups, collectives, and other sort of registered institutions. Our center is one of the few, I would say, in the country as an academic research institute, teaching institute, and we've been working with many of these community members since 2006. So this is sort of a background on the kind of backlash being faced. So in general, in Bangladesh, we inherited the British colonial penal code of 377. We didn't have such fixed ideas about gender binaries. I mean, it wasn't sort of this criminalization. And usually they feel insecure about their identities, their lives, because there's persistent religious and cultural stigmatization. At a society and institutional level, there's a complete denial of their existence. And the validity of, I'm sorry, I'm losing the, yeah, thank you. Validity of such diversity just does not exist, which means that they're either silenced, criminalized, or face the 10 years of prison. But it's more the fear and persecution that's the bigger challenge in terms of actually putting people into jail. So one of the challenges in Bangladesh is, and Magali introduced this session with, there's a staunch heteronormative culture with regards to marriage and children, and diverse sexual identities do not hold any legitimate status. And Bangladesh also remains one of the 70 countries which still has the sodomy law, 377, criminalizing any kind of sexual orientation, and increasingly it's become worse. So I want to say a little bit about the shrinking civil spaces. So I've been working in Bangladesh since 1993, and we've been actively working together since 2006 when I joined the school in 2004. And you've seen a lot of initiatives by many activist groups and organizations from within the community, particularly between the years of 2014 and 16, very, very visible groups working on news magazine, lesbian comic book flashcards, queer theater productions. In fact, reclaiming rights and spaces in very localized context by participating in our Bengali New Year in our own Rainbow Pride rally, where they draped the rainbow flag but wore the local kurta and saris and walked down the street. So all of this was very, very active in the public space and not hidden. But such visible forms of activism suddenly stopped in 2016. Two leading activists, the one who'd taken out the news magazine, Rup Bahan, was murdered, and his friend and peer, who's also actively involved in creating and mobilizing space, was also murdered by Islamic militants. Now, this sort of murder is not so simplistic as in the Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, and these are sort of homegrown, linked to international sort of Islamic terrorist groups who decide just to kill Zulhas and Mahbub, who we'd been working with. Actually, we were working together on a course on sexual diversity and rights, and we had to shut down our website. But it's about a greater attack on secular freedoms as seen by some of these Islamic extremist groups. During this time, during this period of 2016, from 13, 14, 15, 16, there was about 34 different forms of attacks by extremist groups on bloggers, on self-proclaimed atheists, on those who were not considered Islamic in the religion, the Ahmadiyya groups, the religious leaders, a university professor. So initially the government blamed this on the opposition and the Islamic rights groups. But over time, even the government changed its narrative and said that we cannot hurt the religious and national sentiments of a country. And in some ways started blaming the deaths and the murders on the very individuals. So this created a lot of disconnect, instability, and many people I know left the country. Many went underground, and there's a complete silence, and the sort of the smaller movements had kind of fallen apart. Next slide, please. Health and rights. I remember in 2015, we hosted the needs assessment survey. This was done in 2015, and 44%, even before the pandemic, even during their everyday lives, talked about mental stress, constant anxiety, because they didn't want people to find out about their sexuality. In fact, right before Zulhas and Tanmoy were murdered in that year, they were not allowed to participate in the parade. We got calls, lawyers got calls saying, please tell them not to participate, there's death threats. And 34 of them were taken to jail, locked up. Their parents were called and family members and said, come and pick up your son. He's a homosexual. So many of them, their family members did not even know their sons were gay. So there was a lot of persecution, hostility, anger. If you talk about health and rights under COVID, some of the interviews that they did from the 18 interviews, a transgender individual who's transitioning said now there aren't hormonal tablets available because of the lockdown, and it's difficult to get availability of medicines. STI services, our health service systems are quite weak in general, so services have just fallen behind. And medicines in general for HIV/AIDS, transgender, hormonal, or even STI services are basically neglected. And there's also stigma in terms of accessing these services. And this has been amplified during COVID. Next slide. The digital online space, it's sort of this, it plays a space where it's created, it allowed in the 1990s countries in Bangladesh to allow many of these communities to meet each other online, find solidarity, find friendship, find relationships, organize, build unity, discuss issues across the region, within countries, even within, because in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, you could then connect with people outside of Dhaka who didn't have the space necessarily living in rural spaces. And also gave them a form of psychosocial support because there's so much negativity or stigma, or the sort of the double lives that many of them said they led in their homes meant that they lived a lot of their lives in secret. Unfortunately, because of COVID now, there's increased surveillance on online digital spaces because the government, like in many other countries, is got a new law monitoring whatever's written and censorship around COVID measures and the government's measures around COVID. On top of that, I'll show you the next slide. A Digital Security Act was passed in Bangladesh in 2018. And what happened was this really affected, some of the human rights organizations, Amnesty International said, these are very draconian laws because this really, it's such a wide-ranging law that many of them talked about blasphemy. If you heard religious sentiments, anything could be defined as religious sentiment, national sentiment. So it not only criminalized LGBTQI groups on writing, social media posts, but also those who shared comments, liked, engaged on those comments online. The act also criminalized trans communities for using preferred gender names which didn't match their official ID card, because some of them, we have these very, very sort of invasive laws where even if you say you're a trans woman, you're medically examined to identify whether you fit into that biological physical role of a trans woman before you're given that identity. The biggest thing about the Digital Security Act passed in 2018 was it allowed law enforcement officers at any point to search individuals irrespective, to search, to have warrants. And one of the things about this sort of increasing insecure spaces before the pandemic, which is amplified by the pandemic, means that many of the communities are more worried about security and safety rather than whatever little resource they have to mobilize, to work together. Secondly, under the guise of politics, under the Digital Security Act, there have been disappearances. And people say that, they say it's Islamic groups that are being locked up, but people say some of the opposition leaders are being locked up. So there's a lot of a messy, blurred space about what these laws are being used for. Next slide. I'll be done soon, Magali. So another thing with the restrictions of the social spaces was, one thing in the interviews, they said that, they didn't have to move back home. Many of them lived and shared spaces because they had jobs they could rent. They also had spaces to meet. They had, we used to attend exhibitions or poetry competition. I mean, it's all very closed and secure passwords, but there were meeting spaces and even parties. But all of this with the pandemic and the official lockdown from March to June shut down all activities in terms of in-person meetings. Activists and community members continue to engage online, but there's a lot of fears around the threats of being, are we being monitored? Are we being watched? We have to be very careful what kind of digital tools we're using. And there's a lot of fear about, we need to organize and continue to build, but there's a lot of fear about being caught, being harassed, being murdered. And because of the general silence and the actual murderer, the killers of Tonmo and Zulas have never been caught. There's a lack of trust or faith that anyone would actually protect them if anything happened to them. Many of them who moved back home talked a little bit about feeling cooped up, living double lives, because many of their family members didn't know they were activists or they were in relationships. And many of them talked about the pressures where fathers or mothers would say, you need to get married, you need to have children, you're getting of a certain age, or why are you so feminine? Cut your hair short. Why do you dress in this way? You should be more like a man. Some of them said they had to engage in their activism work late at night when everyone was asleep. In fact, one of them was reading a poetry on an online competition organized by the US Embassy, and his uncle overheard him speaking about his experience being a gay man living in Dhaka city. And he was beaten up and kicked out of the home. Next slide. So just to say, against this backdrop, you've also got funding bodies. One global philanthropy project that did a survey of 26 foundations found they were making requirements more flexible, allowing for deadlines, extending, time frames, providing flexible funding. And that has, we need to track and see, because it's very important. There's very little funding or resource or support for these communities and groups. Ultimately, it's researchers or other institutions, and there used to be a lot of research on HIV/AIDS research, but not much on the capacity building or activities to mobilize. At the national level, despite the challenges, despite the struggles politically, socially, economically, the first ever book is coming out on narratives taken out by a group. I'm not going to take names because everyone's sort of anonymous. And we and a bunch of sponsors sponsored these sort of narratives that's been in the work for about 4 or 5 years. Activities continue. I get invites online, very closed exhibitions, meetings, events, and other activities. We're involved in a 7-year project looking at exclusion with the University of Toronto. Final slide. So overall, in general, pre-COVID, during COVID, after COVID, they're just vulnerable groups. The disadvantaged economically, socially, legally, politically. And it's, of course, there's class issues. The transgender tend to be poorer. The ones who have poorer income or less support are suffering more. But even, ironically, the very rich are much more having to follow the heteronormative ideals of marriage and wife because they don't want to lose families, don't want to be outcast from business. This whole impact of not being able to do in-person activism and community building has affected people emotionally and mentally. So whilst digital spaces are meaningful, have opened up spaces with the Digital Security Act, with other kinds of restrictions, with the overall kind of silencing, the power, the politics, there's a lot of uncertainty. So all of this has created a space of uncertainty, and it's created a wider silencing where even researchers or academics like us, I remember when, some of the murders took place, a bunch of us, and I'm not an activist, I'm an academic, we got phone calls from the intelligence saying, are you supporting, are you sponsoring these groups? That this is against the law. So, there's a lot of kind of other kinds of pressure. And in general, some have argued that the government has not played that kind of role that it initially did, where it blamed whatever it was, opposition, it blamed, Islamic groups, and now it's moved to, we can't hurt national and religious sentiment. So we're kind of in this limbo, and these communities are left in a bigger sort of much more fragile, precarious situation. Thank you very much. I just want to acknowledge, last slide. There's, I think, one more slide. There's 2 researchers. We've left them anonymous because, they may face backlash. Funding support from CREA, an organization. This research and other research will, form part of the work that's ongoing in Countering Backlash, led by Yurka, and I'm the country lead for the Bangladesh project. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Sabina, very much. Now, this was very, enlightening and connecting with what we had been discussing before. But I don't want to take time now. We're going to have, so we can have time later. I want to pass to Neil to see, how Europe is considered a civilized place. So enlighten us about what's going on there today, Neil.
Yeah, thank you, Magali. Just very short introduction about myself. So I'm Neil Datta. I'm the secretary of an organization called the European Parliamentary Forum for Sexual Reproductive Rights. So 2 things is that we work exclusively with members of parliament. So all of our work is at a policy level, and we work on sexual reproductive health and rights. And as Magali alluded to, for a long time in Europe, we prided ourselves on having arguably one of the highest standards of sexual and reproductive health and rights in the world. And so for many part, I've been involved in this work for 20 years. And so for the most part of that 20 years, it was a fairly easy job where we were simply gradually, incrementally improving on the rights. And we shifted a lot of our focus to the global south and to take a look at what can be done in terms of Europe's development cooperation aid in the global south to help move along in the same direction. Over the past 10 years or so, we've had to reshift focus, essentially because we have in Europe what is essentially a new social movement that's emerged. So, like in many other places, when abortion was legalized in the late 70s and early 80s in just about all West European countries, very soon afterwards there appeared an anti-abortion movement. So this anti-abortion movement existed in Germany, Spain, France, Scandinavian countries everywhere. And it was not really very powerful. It played the role of a certain nuisance, but it was there. What we've seen over the past few years, past 10 years or so, is as I said, the emergence of a new social movement, which we can call anti-gender. Now, essentially what happened in Europe was that the old anti-abortion organizations rebranded, reorganized, and then expanded their scope so that now they're not only looking at abortion issues, but they're looking at a whole range of different issues which all have gender, or what they call gender ideology, as their common enemy. And so if we take a look at what it is that they're looking at, one of them is very broadly abortion, but also the broader field of sexual and reproductive health and rights. And then there's a newer area of LGBT rights. Then there's also gender in and of itself. And so this is how we see that gender studies in different universities are being specifically targeted, or laws on gender-based violence also. A new area that we're seeing as a subject of target in these anti-gender mobilizations are children's rights. So that children's rights to education, homeschooling, comprehensive sexuality education, but that's an old one. And then also a fifth area, which is that of non-discrimination, and specifically non-discrimination towards women, LGBT persons, etc., specifically putting up these protections as being an encroachment or an infringement upon what they call religious freedom. So my right as a religious person, usually only a Christian religious person, because they haven't really explored what this would mean if they actually meant if other faith persons had the same rights. But how does my right as a Christian religious person is offended if I'm confronted with a gay couple or other types of things? So we see this new movement in Europe emerging. Certain key aspects also took place in the past 10 years. Two trends. One of them is professionalization. Another one is transnational networking. So in terms of professionalization, we can see this most obviously in their ability to influence policies, or at least try to influence policies. So for the past 30 years, basically the field of human rights was a progressive private hunting ground. We just had to make our case in a specific area of human rights, and then they would gradually improve because we would make the case and we had evidence to support this. Now there's a whole group of organizations that know how policy processes work and make opposite cases which erode human rights. And this is something that we as a community, specifically here in Europe, I think perhaps in Latin America, they're more advanced with this, but in Europe, we still have to deal with the existence, with the emergence of this new community. New tools that we've seen emerge is that of litigation, and specifically US lawyer organizations setting up shop in Europe and setting up offices in Europe, specifically in Europe's decision-making centers for human rights. So these American groups are not setting up shop in Paris or Berlin, they're coming to Brussels, Strasbourg, Geneva, etc. We also see mass mobilizations taking place, and also the creation of social media platforms. So we've all received petitions in our inboxes, click here, save the dolphins or the rainforest, etc. Now there's an ultra-conservative one based out of Madrid in Spain, which is active all over Europe, and probably also in your respective regions. It's called Citizen Go. And so we see this new skill set being organized. We also see that these previously national groups have then coalesced and started meeting transnationally. Now, this is not a conspiracy theory. This is simply the emergence of a modern movement. They are able to do this just like all of us are. They're organizing their own webinars, just like we are here at MenEngage. So they're doing the same thing. We are able to identify some of these networks that they've created. One of them is called Agenda Europe, which has been meeting annually since 2013. And then it is from the coordination within these anti-gender organizations that we see similar types of initiatives emerging more or less at the same time in several countries at the same time, so that the anti-LGBT measures of Croatia, Slovenia, Romania, and Slovakia happening between 2013 up until now all had the same point of origin. And similarly, we know that they were able to coordinate in respect to their strategies on abortion. And now I'll zoom in a little bit on abortion. We know from their own documents that they have a very clear strategy in relation to abortion. Their strategy is threefold. One, restrict. First, prevent, then restrict, and then third, prohibit. So if you live in a certain country where you have a liberal abortion law and you cannot make progress, then try to prevent abortions. And so this is how we see the emergence of crisis pregnancy counseling centers in a number of different countries. And just one example, it is in the Netherlands in 2013, so quite recently, that the government started funding a new organization which is involved in trying to prevent women from having abortion through misleading information. So this is in the Netherlands. Next, restrict. So we saw different initiatives to try to restrict the existing abortion laws. One of the most famous ones was in 2013, 2014 in Spain, which would have brought the abortion law back to a pre-Franco situation. The most telling example in terms of prohibit is what we saw just the past few weeks in Poland with a constitutional court judgment which would seek to ban abortion. It's already very, very restricted, but to ban abortion even in the case of fetal anomaly. So this, I mean, in my opinion, this goes beyond right to choose or right to life or whatever. You're interfering there with the medical decision between a woman and her doctors. And this is the judgment of the Constitutional Tribunal. Maybe 4 things to keep in mind about Poland right now and the recent judgment. I think my time is almost up, but I'll take my cue from Magali. 4 things to remember about the Constitutional Tribunal judgment of just this. It was published just 10 days ago. First, it's illegal. This judgment was rendered by a court, by a constitutional tribunal whose very legitimacy is highly, highly contested in Poland, and it is subject to rule of law infringement proceedings by the EU. So the judgment itself is illegal. Secondly, it's inhumane for the reasons I've mentioned. Third, it is just the start. This judgment is the product of the influence of a specific organization. This organization called Ordo Iuris has a broad legislative normative agenda encompassing all of the areas I've mentioned: SRHR, LGBT, gender, non-discrimination, and children's rights. So if this thing gets through in Poland, get ready for an avalanche of other measures which will restrict further human rights. Fourth point to keep in mind about Poland also is that what happens in Poland will not stay in Poland. So that just this past weekend, the Polish government submitted as its candidate to the European Court of Human Rights the very founder of this organization that I mentioned, Ordo Iuris. So there's the deliberate intention to internationalize, to Europeanize what is happening in Poland beyond its own borders. So I'll just end here with maybe one question to everyone, is that we've been talking about backlash, but at the very beginning, it was Nikki who mentioned a good friend of mine, David Paternotte, who wrote this piece about beyond backlash. And while backlash is certainly a component of what we're seeing, I have to really wonder if it's maybe not an incomplete vision or understanding of it, whereas in fact the stakes are much bigger than human rights and certainly women's rights or LGBT rights, but whether we're actually talking about a much broader, more ambitious and sinister political project that we have to get our heads around. So I'll thank you for that.
No, absolutely. I think we try not to think about that to be able to focus on what's in front of us. But it's, David Paternotte's piece on Beyond Backlash is really fantastic and a must read. And switching gears for those of you who need interpretation, porque vamos a hablar en español. I want to ask Maria Alicia, to join us and speak from your perspective. At least you got some results to cheer us up. So, bienvenida, Maria Alicia.
Bueno, en principio, muchísimas gracias por la invitación al simposio, especialmente a Magali Márquez. Y quería decir que así como me presentaste como académica de la Universidad de Buenos Aires, yo básicamente o conjuntamente soy activista. y soy activista por los derechos sexuales y reproductivos y el aborto desde fines de los 80, y por supuesto formé parte de el armado y la organización de la campaña nacional por el derecho al aborto legal, seguro y gratuito, que fue en el año 2005. Me interesa remarcar esto porque no hay demasiada contradicción en Argentina entre ser una académica y una activista. De hecho, desarrollamos mucho activismo adentro de las universidades. Desde la campaña surgió una red que se llama la Red por el Derecho al Aborto y los Derechos Sexuales y Reproductivos, y hemos creado en 23 universidades nacionales de diversos temas, medicina, derecho, filosofía, sociales, hemos creado cátedras libres por el derecho al aborto. Esa fue una de las formas, muchas, de expansión de nuestra estrategia. La campaña, como dije, surge en el año 2005, es tributaria de históricas luchas y formas de participación asamblearia. Algunas de ellas. La Argentina tiene hace 38 años encuentros nacionales de mujeres, que ahora está cambiando por plurinacional, de mujeres lesbianas, travestis, trans, intersex, no binarias, etcétera, por la participación enorme de estos grupos y de los pueblos originarios, que se desarrollan todos los años en distintas provincias del país, y allí desde el año 80 y pico estamos debatiendo los derechos sexuales y reproductivos y el aborto, y enfrentando a los sectores de la Iglesia Católica que participaban de manera muy activa en esos encuentros. Por supuesto que las estrategias que estos grupos han tomado en los últimos años, como bien explicó Neil, son un poco diferentes a los que desarrollaban en los 90. El año 2001 hay un hecho clave en la Argentina, que es una gran crisis política, económica, y se genera todo un movimiento social muy importante que va a cuestionar a las formas organizativas y de construcción política del poder de los partidos políticos, y plantear que un nuevo mundo es posible, como venían planteando zapatistas y el Foro Social Mundial. De allí surge una experiencia muy rica, asamblearia. La campaña retoma desde los años 2003 esa experiencia de luchas, que en los 90 fueron muy intensas porque teníamos un gobierno antiderechos, retoma la historia de los derechos humanos a la Argentina, que es desde la última dictadura militar en el 76, y de allí viene el emblema de nuestro pañuelo. El pañuelo verde, como ven ahí, tiene una metaforización directa al pañuelo blanco de las madres y las abuelas de Plaza de Mayo. Tan es así que por eso no lo usamos en la cabeza, sino en el cuello, en la muñeca y en distintos lugares del cuerpo. Entonces, esta campaña surge con toda esa historia que le va a dar un sentido muy significativo, y yo creo que ahí hay una clave de su riqueza, que es federal, o sea, es de todo el país, es profundamente plural, es profundamente diversa, y se estructura políticamente en un ejercicio profundamente democrático. Esto no quiere decir que no haya habido en 15 años, por supuesto, conflictos, intereses diversos, formas distintas de pensar la construcción del poder, debates de poder adentro de la campaña, pero creo que esa conformación le permitió resistir con una enorme persistencia, con una enorme paciencia y con cierto grado, podríamos decir, de tolerancia. A su vez, la campaña se plantea un objetivo, que era despenalizar y legalizar el aborto. Entonces, inicialmente se arma el primer proyecto que se presenta. El proyecto se presentó 7 veces y no tuvo curso de debate en las cámaras legislativas, Pero ese proyecto, desde el principio, el primero hasta el último, se construye colectivamente. No hay un grupo de expertos que arman, o expertas que arman el proyecto, sino que hay una comisión redactora que le da formato legal, como debe ser para poderlo presentar, producto de un debate que ha llevado más de un año en las distintas formas organizativas que tiene el país. Para pertenecer a la campaña, solo hay que estar de acuerdo con la consigna. Educación sexual para decidir, anticonceptivos para no abortar y aborto legal para no morir. Por eso, nuestra ley tiene esa integralidad. No era etapista, no era primero una cosa y después la otra, sino es una concepción, podríamos decir, absolutamente integral. Por eso, frente a los rechazos sistemáticos de poder debatir el proyecto de ley, se produce en la campaña una expansión fuertemente rizomática de lo que llamamos la despenalización social del aborto. Surgen grupos de lesbianas que van a dar información y editar un manual para el uso de misoprostol, intentando ahí quitarle el poder a, valga la redundancia, el poder médico hegemónico y colocar el poder en manos de las mujeres. Surge la red de socorristas, que son mujeres que acompañan a mujeres a abortar. Surge la red de profesionales de la salud, que son profesionales que trabajan en el sistema público nacional, para el acceso a las interrupciones legales del aborto. Nosotros tenemos legalidad desde el Código Penal del año 1921 por causales. La ley que tenemos ahora es interrupción voluntaria del embarazo, o sea, es por plazos, hasta las 14 semanas es voluntaria, sin ninguna explicación, y después de las 14 semanas es causal. Surge también de la campaña la red de abogadas para llevar adelante los litigios estratégicos. Surge una red de comunicadoras para discutir y debatir la comunicación de la campaña y la estética de la comunicación de la campaña. Y surge también una colectiva sexo-genérica política de disidencias sexuales desde dentro de la propia campaña. Entonces, para cuando tenemos la posibilidad de debatir en el 2018, nosotros venimos haciendo un trabajo social y de expansión social muy grande, que además los feminismos populares o comunitarios lo han hecho en los territorios más vulnerables donde trabajaban. ¿Qué quiero decir con esto? Que si bien la campaña tiene como fundamento el problema de salud pública, el problema de injusticia social y deuda de la democracia, esos son nuestros tres, fundamentos de la campaña, esta demanda por un derecho profundamente individual y profundamente liberal, es un derecho que lo transforma en un derecho colectivo, es justamente la práctica política. Por ejemplo, con el Ni Una Menos, que es el grupo que pone el problema de la violencia y de los feminicidios, tanto en mujeres como en personas LGTBI queer. Por ejemplo, con las asambleas de los paros internacionales de mujeres y tantas organizaciones más, permiten que el 2018 aparezca la marea verde como si fuera algo mágico, y en realidad nosotros entregábamos pañuelos verdes desde el año 2003, con mucho rechazo, pero que esto fue creciendo el apoyo social en esta enorme cantidad de años, ¿no? Creo que La marea verde, por eso hoy, alberga múltiples sentidos. Por supuesto, el derecho al aborto, pero también las múltiples demandas de los múltiples feminismos y de los grupos LGTBQI y más, y estamos absolutamente aliadas a luchas diversas como las luchas medioambientales y varias otras cuestiones. Debo decir que excepto algunas regiones del país, no hubo una fuerte incorporación, si bien hubo interlocución, debates, muchas diferencias con los pueblos originarios y con los grupos, afrodescendientes. Participaron en algunos lugares en la campaña, pero no fueron los grupos, podríamos decir, más significativos, a diferencia de otros países de la región, sobre todo los países andinos, ¿no? Que tienen un fuerte componente ahí de pueblos originarios. En la medida en que la campaña se estructura como fundamento en contra de la desigualdad social, en contra del acceso, del no acceso a la salud integral como derecho humano básico, en el principio de los derechos humanos y una deuda de la democracia, o sea, el proceso de ciudadanización y la exclusión de las mujeres y los grupos LGTBQI y más de la ciudadanización, la campaña surge intersectorial. Es desde sus orígenes profundamente intersectorial, aunque eso signifique enormes debates adentro, diferencias y diversidades respecto incluso acerca de esas demandas. Por eso la marea verde tiene la expansión que tiene. La marea verde trasciende a la campaña, si bien surge hace 17 años desde allí, trasciende a la campaña y se integra a una enormidad de luchas, básicamente de luchas antipatriarcales, antisenófobas, antirracistas, e incorpora a la campaña un dato que para mí es muy importante, que es la intergeneracionalidad. La campaña la componen personas de 85 años y jóvenes de 15 años. Todo ese espectro enorme forma parte de la campaña y hubo, no sin problemas, una interlocución muy importante que permitió ligar algo que para mí es clave, que es la genealogía de las luchas. Si no, hay una fantasía de que todo empieza cuando uno llega. Y en realidad hay que recuperar toda esa historia de lucha que, bueno, en el caso argentino son desde los años 60, en grupos más chiquitos, en grupos más grandes, la incorporación también a la campaña de los grupos de derechos humanos. Podríamos decir que la amplitud de apoyos fue enorme, pero que fue creciendo lentamente. Por lo tanto, este proceso de la marea verde, que también incorpora a la región, porque la campaña nacional argentina, desde el año 2017, coordina la campaña 28 de septiembre, que es por la despenalización y la legalización del aborto en América Latina y el Caribe, que existe desde los años 90 y que antes tenía una coordinación básicamente de Nicaragua. Entonces ahí articulamos acciones de apoyo conjunto en toda la región. Por otro lado, en el debate del 2018 y al calor del Ni Una Menos también, y en el debate del 2020, el apoyo internacional fue enorme, con los famosos pañuelazos, seguro habrán visto, en casi todas las embajadas argentinas, en lugares que ni siquiera sabemos cómo se llegó hasta esas regiones. Un dato más. La campaña está constituida por activistas. No hay personas rentadas al interior de la campaña. Y eso me parece un dato también a pensar. No quiere decir que la campaña no ha tenido financiamiento, pero los financiamientos de la campaña son para el desarrollo de las acciones. La gente trabaja en cualquier trabajo y activa en la campaña. Hay una larga tradición de activismo en la Argentina, no rentado. Y sobre todo, por la crítica fuerte que hubo sobre los procesos de ONGización que se produjeron en la década del 90 y demás, y los problemas que han traído a otras organizaciones en el país la cuestión de los financiamientos. En el año 2020, y ya voy cerrando, se produce una situación bastante inédita, que es que el Poder Ejecutivo decide que va a enviar al Legislativo, nosotros como campaña ya habíamos enviado el nuestro, con muchos apoyos, que va a enviar al Legislativo un proyecto propio. Lo estaba enviando cuando viene la pandemia. Entonces esto se para, la campaña sigue activando muchísimo por las vías virtuales, y en el mes de noviembre empezamos a hacer acciones callejeras, pequeñas, pero muy contundentes, para presionar al gobierno. Finalmente en diciembre presenta el proyecto, y ahí creo que es importante tener algo claro. Si uno va por un proyecto de ley, hay una habilitación que tiene que hacer el gobierno de turno. Sin habilitación del gobierno de turno, por lo cual los legisladores y legisladoras se alinean, es bastante difícil. Ahora, sin organización social y sin presión de las organizaciones feministas, y más que feministas, en la calle, tampoco es posible. Porque también nos enfrentamos muy fuertemente con los grupos, como claramente lo explicó Neil, que están en contra de la Ley de Educación Sexual Integral, que en la Argentina existe del año 2006, que han sacado la campaña Con mis hijos no te metas, que están en contra de la aplicación de la Ley de Identidad de Género, que es una ley muy importante y despatologizante, que están en contra, por supuesto, del aborto. Y desarrollaron sus estrategias muy, muy fuertemente. Y yo creo fervientemente que ya a esta altura no son grupos religiosos solamente. Creo que a esta altura son grupos fundamentalistas conservadores, con fuertes aliados conservadores laicos, que van tras un proyecto civilizatorio muchísimo más integral. Y acuerdo con Neil que la ideología de género, o en contra de la ideología de género, es la punta de lanza que pusieron tanto en Naciones Unidas como en OEA, como en la Unión Europea, es la punta, y en los países, es la punta de lanza de una estrategia mucho más integral. Y para cerrar, hemos sido atacados, yo personalmente, por las redes sociales, por supuesto. Y uno de los ataques en lo personal de las redes sociales fue en TikTok, el grupo de jóvenes que son de extrema derecha, en TikTok, donde me atacan como adoctrinamiento en la universidad pública. Está habiendo varios ataques acusando de adoctrinamiento a la universidad pública, por lo cual creemos que, frente a la ley de aborto, van a ir por la educación pública, y la educación sexual integral, y ya fueron por acciones judiciales en distintas provincias del país. O sea que el tener una ley es un piso básico, necesario, pero no es suficiente, y por supuesto seguiremos en la lucha por la implementación. Bueno, muchas gracias.
Gracias, Maria. Thank you. I'm going to switch back to English. This was very exciting and so much to absorb. I just wanted to open, to questions. Sinead, is there any question that you would like to prioritize that you've seen in the chat? Otherwise, we can open to the panelists themselves.
Yeah, and we don't have many questions, so I do encourage everyone to leave your questions in the chat box. We did have one, however, from Jurker. It was specifically to Neil, asking, could we hear more about the links, if any, between these movements and right-wing nationalist movements, aka fascist ones?
Yep. Shall I go?
Yeah, yep. Yeah, please.
Okay, thanks. Yes, thank you, Jörker, for that question. Yes, we do see links between the anti-gender movement and then also far-right fascist movements. Maybe one way to look at it is to see it as there are three movements in society which pre-existed, but they've been able to find each other, and by interacting with each other, they are able to access power. So one of these movements has been the religious communities, which have always had a socially normative agenda against sexual reproductive health and rights. So they've been around for forever, as long as women's rights have existed. Separately, you have far-right fascist movements, which, at least in Europe, have existed in almost every country since the early part of the 20th century, many parts of Latin America and other regions of the world. The two of them were not the same. The religious and the far-right were separate movements, although there were bridges between them. And then now we have populism as a force, which is neutral. You can be far-right, far-left, none of the above, and still be populist. And we've seen by the three of them interacting with each other, they're able to access positions of power. Maybe a good way of understanding this is to look at the outgoing Trump administration, where you have a very telling example of those three forces, where President Trump represented the forces of populism. I mean, I think we can all agree after 4 years of Trump that there's nothing substantive in the man. He was there simply to be in power. Separately, the far right was represented by Steve Bannon, his former White House advisor. There is a genuine thinking about, which is from the far right school of thought. And then the religious actor was our poor Vice President Mike Pence. We shouldn't have too much pity for him, but he was there, and we saw how the three of them were able to interact. They created this uneasy three-way marriage, and were able to access positions of power. And so we see this in different ways also, taking place at national level in different ways. So that in France, you have this within one political party of the Front National, the Rassemblement National. You also have this in the Alternative für Deutschland to a certain extent. And you can find it in different versions in many places. So I hope that covers the far-right links.
Thank you, Neil. And since Sabina needs to leave soon, I just wanted to ask Sabina if you have anything that you wanted to add after you heard the other presentations, so we don't miss your insights. You're muted.
It's quite alarming, the different kinds of alliances and networks that are everywhere to kind of silence voices and, create a sort of what I would say we're going to regressive policies and views and communities and societies. But otherwise, I just really learned a lot, and I appreciate being part of this panel. And I wanted to apologize. I just have this COVID-19 means we have back-to-back meetings at all hours. So I have to leave, but I just want to say thank you very much. Very interesting. Quite scary times we live in. Yeah.
Thank you, Sabina. We'll be in touch with you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
So Sinead, any other question you want to bring to our attention?
No, nothing specific from the chat box. Maybe we could bring everyone, I'm not sure if the others are still there, but maybe we could bring on Becky or Alex, see if they wanted to respond to what was shared in the second conversation.
Or whether Neil or Maria have comments on what you other presented. I'm really interested in the intersectionality piece here.
Yeah, María, ¿tienes algo
que sí, aquí estoy. El tema de la interseccionalidad no fue definido en la trayectoria de la campaña como tal. Digamos, no es que se discutió teóricamente. La campaña se compone de toda aquella persona que quiere estar. No tiene ningún otro requisito. Tiene que estar de acuerdo con la consigna, como dije. Entonces, en ese sentido, se fue construyendo una experiencia donde la diversidad era parte, yo diría casi como del origen, como del sentido de esa construcción. Sí creo que la discusión sobre interseccionalidad ha tenido un espacio muy fuerte en lo que yo conté de los encuentros nacionales de mujeres. El cambio de nombre de los encuentros nacionales de mujeres está siendo profundamente debatido, profundamente resistido, aún por grupos de feministas, no resistidos por digamos, antifeminismos, ideología de género, sino por grupos feministas, porque me parece que eso es interesante también mostrarlo. Así como detectamos, y en Argentina hay muchos trabajos hechos sobre las acciones, las formas organizativas, las formas de comunicación y también los argumentos de los grupos antiderechos, fundamentalistas, también creo que es importante marcar, y España es un ejemplo, el enorme peso de los grupos feministas RADFEM, las llamadas TERF, digamos, que también están operando fuertemente en una recuperación del feminismo radical, a mi entender, descontextualizado y modificado, en un ataque a los grupos LGTBIQ y más, y que se pegan peligrosamente, no digo que lo sean, digo que se pegan peligrosamente a los grupos de extrema derecha, dentro de los propios feminismos. Entonces, a mí me parece que todo este tema de la interseccionalidad en Argentina está muy atravesado por todas las luchas antiminería, antiextractivismo. Ahí están todos los grupos feministas operando en defensa del medio ambiente. Pero creo que es un debate muy importante a dar adentro de los feminismos, incluso. Tanto en el campo académico, que quizás ahí está más desarrollado, pero en el campo de las organizaciones y de las prácticas políticas. Creo que eso es muy importante, porque puede haber un discurso muy interseccional, pero después la práctica política, donde hay que convivir, debatir y encontrar consensos, la transforman en una acción que es complicada y que no es fácil.
Neil or Becky, do you want to comment? I don't know if Alex is still I think she had to leave.
Yeah, I'm happy to say very briefly on intersectionalism. One, and I want to say two things on intersectionalism. One is that the anti-gender, they also engage in intersectionalism. So I've just shared an article from Anne Applebaum, a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, who wrote a very interesting piece on how to build a far-right party. And one interesting anecdote that she says, she tried to make intersectionalism fun and accessible. She says that basically the way that these groups try to access power is a bit in the same way that that you would create a boy band. Now, we're all from generations where we're familiar with boy bands, and so you know that in a boy band, you have the athletic one, the nice one, the bad boy, etc. These groups try to cobble together an alliance where they bring together the Christians, the far right, the corporate interests, etc. And so this is how they are practicing a type of intersectionalism, where they're cobbling together around a loose agenda, very disparate sectors that have nothing to do with each other. And we see that this is how the far right is actually accessing power or making gains in countries which are, you wouldn't expect, like the Netherlands. You have this Forum for Democracy, a new political party, where basically they themselves openly talk about how they've created a pagan Christian party that's there for business interests. Now, just think through that a little bit, what that means. And then in terms of intersectionalism on our side, I think we have to go beyond a little bit the traditional intersectionalism that we talk about, such as SRHR, women's groups, LGBT, men's groups, or etc., but go even beyond that and really to engage with the people working on monitoring democracy, those who are monitoring corruption. For example, what I found is that when you take a look at the money coming into the anti-gender organizations, a lot of it is dark money. You have groups monitoring corruption and flows of illicit funding, for example, from Russia. So they know it's happening, but then they stop at what is being used for. Whereas our people, we know what this money is being used for. For example, a homophobic initiative in this or that country. So we need to build those bridges there in areas that, you know, traditionally don't work together, and we don't see that we have necessarily much of an overlap. Same with climate change and the environmental groups. A lot of the climate change deniers that they're confronting with, also it's the same groups that are promoting anti-gender initiatives. So that there's a whole range of different types of much more expansive intersectionality that we need to engage in. So thank you.
Absolutely, thank you, Neil. And I think there's a lot that we need to do our homework to be able to organize as successfully as they did in Argentina. And intersectionality will, you know, is a piece to be dealt with differently, because Argentina has a different context. You know, if you move from Argentina to Brazil, you already have to engage in terms of intersectionality with the African Brazilian movement, you know, in a completely different way, because it's a very large constituency. So it's you know, the contexts will vary as well. Becky, I know, yeah, I want to give you a chance if you want to say something. We're kind of, you know, about the time, but I just wanted to give you like a minute if you want to say something.
Just thanks for a great symposium, and just to, for me, this has really raised the importance of evidence and research, of looking at the global comparative experiences. It was so fascinating to hear about the TikTok example from Argentina, that the platforms, the way that movements move between different platforms and deploy different strategies. It's really vital that we collaborate and build up evidence and data, and even for the kind of non-digital researchers to be looking at these spaces, I think is really, really important. But thanks for a really great meeting.
Yeah, no, this was fascinating, and I think there's a lot that we need to come to grips and understand more in depth. When Maria was saying about the history and the inclusion of all these different sectors, that's, I think, it's the challenge in also not to engage everybody from these different different stakeholders, but also without losing sight of what's at the core. Because especially when you're dealing with something as they did in Argentina with abortion, it's very easy, as we think about the patriarchal and the backlash, to start saying, oh, but it's much more than abortion. But you have to be strategic, but also not losing sight of the attack of the far right on the binary, and like that, to maintain the binary, to maintain the status quo, because that has ramifications with the neoliberalism, with the type of society that they already have in place. So that it is in place, not they, but and that some people benefit from that structure. So I think it's very complex, and I'm eager to connect with all of you to see how we can replicate the successes of places like Argentina, and control the damage. Let's say in the United States, and maybe Neil can connect to this. The fact that people have focused on, in terms of abortion, just to stay with what Maria Alicia had said, this whole thing about, and that you had said, preventing, restricting, and prohibiting, and going in a cascade. I think the women's movement has focused so much on the prevention, embarking on the dialogue with the far right of saying, oh, okay, they want to prevent abortion, so let's do that. And we strengthen the narrative of prevention of abortion with them, without realizing that was just a step towards restriction, instead of being more open about, no, we don't have to prevent in case people don't want to, So it's like, it's, I think we need to question, looking backwards, how much did we fall into that narrative of allowing the steps to continue. And then when the prevention narrative was already very strong, then they just move into the restrictions, and we didn't know how to act because we had fallen into the prevention narrative instead of sticking to the right of bodily autonomy. So it's just that I'm just putting as a provocation that we need to question everything. Maybe I'm completely wrong right now, but those are the questions that I think we need to ask ourselves. What is the strategy, and how do we move even on the other aspects of the backlash, that it's not only abortion, but abortion is a central element, as it is the gender binary, restrictive and exclusive. We're past our time by 4 minutes, unless someone has something burning to say, which I open to you from the panel.
Yo quiero decir una cosa. El proyecto de ley de Argentina que se aprobó incluye como sujete de la ley a las personas no gestantes. El artículo primero dice mujeres y personas gestantes, o sea, las personas trans. Y esto fue producto de esta interseccionalidad y de este debate profundo con los grupos LGBTQ y más. Lo quiero decir porque creo que es el único proyecto en el mundo que se logró incluir esta dimensión. Y la otra cuestión respecto a los discursos y las narrativas de los grupos conservadores, creo que hay que retomar seriamente todo lo que tiene que ver con el discurso del odio. Articulan narrativas que se corren muchísimo de la racionalidad occidental, por decirlo de alguna manera, y en ese campo nos dejan sin posibilidad de interlocución y debate, y pegan muy fuerte en el sentido común porque apelan al mundo afectivo y sensible. Creo que eso es un tema también que podríamos retomar, y muchísimas gracias por la invitación y este diálogo tan interesante.
Gracias a ti. Nikki, any, wise words to close our panel today? Did we lose Nikki? No, there she is.
No, I'm here. Sorry. I was so busy listening to Maria Alicia. That's such an interesting point. So yeah, just to say from Magali and I and Sinead and all the organisers, and to thank the interpreters as well for their really hard work, because I know this is really more difficult online than it is offline. We're hoping that Loka has just emailed to say he's awake but still not feeling well, so we're hoping we'll include him in another panel in future. And we'll definitely be sending out information about the next panel, as Jirka mentioned, which is picking up on some of these threads in a month or so. So thank you all for coming. I think we're already beginning to build this intersectional alliance to try and counter some of the things that we've been hearing today. So thank you very much. Hasta luego, Maria Alicia. Goodbye, everybody.